Here is something that took me a long time to understand, and that I wish someone had explained to me clearly when I was still young enough for it to change the trajectory of everything that followed. The people who arrive at retirement without what they need almost never lost it in a single dramatic moment. There was no catastrophic investment, no fraud that wiped the accounts clean overnight, no single decision that can be pointed to as the moment everything went wrong. What happened instead was quieter than that, more gradual, more invisible. A series of habits that felt completely reasonable at the time, that looked like normal life from the inside, and that only revealed the full extent of their damage decades later, when the window for correction had mostly closed. I have watched this happen to people I knew well, people who earned good money, people who were not reckless or irresponsible by any reasonable definition of those words, people who did most things right and got to 65 and sat down with their numbers and felt a kind of confusion that was almost worse than the financial reality itself, because they could not identify the moment it went wrong. It did not go wrong in a moment. It went wrong slowly, quietly, in the accumulation of habits that seemed harmless or even sensible while they were forming. What I want to do today is name those habits, not to produce guilt about the past. Guilt does not compound. What I want to do is describe the patterns clearly enough that someone watching this can recognize them, can see which ones are still operating in their own life right now, and can make a different decision while there is still time for that decision to matter. The first habit is the one that I watched destroy more retirement potential than almost anything else I observed over decades of paying attention to how people around me handled money. And it is a habit that gets rewarded and encouraged by almost every social structure a person moves through during their working years. It is the habit of treating income growth as permission to spend more. Here is how it works in practice. A person starts their career earning a modest salary. They live within that salary because they have to. There is not much left over, but the basics are covered and life is manageable. Then the career progresses. The salary goes up. And the natural, almost automatic response to that increase is to upgrade the life to match. A better apartment, a newer car, nicer restaurants, vacations that were not possible before. All of it reasonable, all of it earned, all of it feeling like the appropriate reward for years of work and growth. And then the salary goes up again, and the life upgrades again. And this continues decade after decade, with each increase in income being absorbed almost entirely by a corresponding increase in expenditure. The person looks successful from the outside because they are living at the ceiling of their income. And they feel successful from the inside because the life around them reflects the career they have built. What is not visible from either angle is that the gap between what they earn and what they save has remained essentially unchanged since their first job. The income grew. The lifestyle grew to match it. The wealth did not. I knew a man who spent 30 years in corporate management. By the end of his career, he was earning more in a single year than I earned in my first decade of working. He arrived at 63 with less saved than I had accumulated by 45. Not because he was foolish, not because he made dramatic mistakes, because every raise he received for 30 years was fully consumed by the life he was living within 6 months of receiving it. The gap that should have been the engine of his retirement was never allowed to exist. What I learned from watching him, and from watching others like him, is that the decision about what to do with an income increase has to be made before the increase arrives, not after. Because after the increase arrives, the lifestyle has already begun to adjust. The mental accounting has already recategorized what is possible. The new ceiling has already become the new floor. The only way to protect the gap is to make a deliberate decision in advance that a specific portion of every income increase goes somewhere it cannot be spent. Automatically, before it becomes available, before the lifestyle has a chance to absorb it. The second habit is the one that I believe costs people more in absolute dollar terms than any other single behavior, and it is a habit so common that most people do not even recognize it as a choice. It is the habit of waiting to start. Not waiting because of ignorance. Most people understand in a general way that they should be saving for retirement, not waiting because of poverty. Many of the people I am describing had sufficient income to contribute something meaningful at almost any point in their careers. Waiting because of a feeling that now is not quite the right time. That things are a little complicated at the moment. That next year, when the car is paid off or the kids are through school or the raise comes through, then it will make more sense to start. I want to put a number on what that waiting actually costs, because the abstract understanding that starting earlier is better does not capture the reality of what a single year of delay produces at the other end. A person who contributes a consistent amount to a retirement account starting at 35, and does so for 30 years, will accumulate approximately twice what a person contributes the same amount starting at 45 and doing so for 20 years, assuming the same rate of return. Not somewhat more, not meaningfully more, twice. The 10 years of delay does not cost 10 years of contributions. It costs the compounding effect of those 10 years on every dollar contributed afterward. The earlier years are not just earlier, they are the years that do the most work. Removing them from the equation does not just reduce the total, it removes the foundation that everything else was supposed to build on. I tell people this, and I watch them understand it intellectually, and I watch them continue to delay anyway. Because the mechanism that produces delay is not ignorance of the math. It is the inability to feel the future cost of a present inaction. The contribution that does not happen this year does not feel like a loss this year. The loss appears 15 years from now, in a number that is half of what it should have been, attached to a set of circumstances that can no longer be changed. The time to start is not when the conditions are perfect. The conditions will never be perfect. The time to start is now, with whatever is available, at whatever imperfect moment this happens to be. The third habit is one that I watched play out in the lives of people who owned real estate. People who had done something genuinely right by purchasing property and building equity over decades, and who then systematically undid the benefit of that decision through a pattern so common it has become almost invisible. It is the habit of using the house as a bank account. Here is what this looks like in practice. A person buys a house in their 30s. They make payments faithfully for 10 or 12 years. The equity builds. And then something comes up. A renovation that feels necessary. A period where expenses exceeded income. A debt consolidation that seems to make financial sense because the mortgage rate is lower than the credit card rate. So they refinance. They pull equity out. The clock on the mortgage resets. And the equity that took 12 years to build is largely gone. Then it happens again. A few years later, another refinancing, another equity extraction, another reset. By the time this person reaches 60, they have effectively paid for the same house 3 times in interest and principal payments, and they own less of it than they did at 50. The asset that should have been one of the primary pillars of their retirement has been continuously harvested to fund a lifestyle that could not otherwise sustain itself. I am not speaking theoretically. I watched a couple I knew well go through exactly this cycle 4 times over the course of their marriage. 4 refinances, 4 resets, 4 moments where the decision felt financially reasonable in isolation and was financially destructive in the context of the whole. When they finally sold the house at 68 to downsize, the equity they captured was a fraction of what 40 years of ownership should have produced. The rest had been spent, gradually, in transactions that each seemed justified at the time. The house is not a bank account. The equity in it is not a resource to be drawn on for current consumption. It is a long-term asset whose value depends entirely on being left alone to accumulate. Every time it is accessed for anything other than a genuine emergency or a deliberate retirement strategy, the retirement it was supposed to support gets smaller. The fourth habit is one that I think is particularly dangerous because it feels like prudence rather than risk. It feels like the responsible, conservative approach, and it quietly produces one of the most vulnerable retirement situations that exists. It is the habit of depending on a single source of retirement income. Most people who are approaching retirement with a plan built around one source, whether that is Social Security, a pension, a 401k, or any other single vehicle, have constructed a retirement that is one event away from a serious problem. A pension that gets reduced or eliminated when a company restructures. A Social Security system whose future benefit levels are subject to legislative decisions that no individual can control. A 401k whose value is subject to market conditions at the exact moment retirement begins. What I observed in the people who navigated retirement with genuine security is that they arrived with multiple streams. Not all of them large, not all of them glamorous, but multiple. A rental property producing modest monthly income. Dividend-producing investments that had been accumulating for years alongside the primary retirement account. A small consulting arrangement that could be maintained part-time. The specific combination varied. The principle was consistent. No single source represented the entire income picture. If one stream diminished or disappeared, the others continued. Building this kind of structure does not require extraordinary income or sophisticated financial knowledge. It requires a decision, made early enough in the working years to act on, that the retirement income picture should not be a single column. The person who makes that decision at 40 has 25 years to build something alongside their primary retirement vehicle. The person who makes it at 55 has 10. Both are better than the person who arrives at 65 with everything depending on one source that turns out to be smaller or less reliable than expected. The fifth habit is one that I mention because I have never seen it discussed seriously in the context of retirement planning, and because the cumulative financial effect of it, measured honestly over a full career, is genuinely significant. It is the habit of never reviewing fixed costs. Every person reading this has a set of expenses that recur automatically every month, without requiring a decision. Insurance premiums, subscription services, bank fees, membership costs, utility plans, phone and internet packages. These costs were all set up at some point in the past, at prices that reflected the market conditions and the person's priorities at that moment. And in most cases they have continued unchanged since then, renewed automatically, debited quietly, never examined against current alternatives or current needs. I sat down with a close friend in his late 50s and went through his monthly fixed costs line by line. Not the discretionary spending, just the automatic recurring charges. What we found took us both by surprise. Insurance policies that had not been compared against the market in over a decade and were priced significantly above what was available. Subscription services that he had signed up for and largely stopped using, but that continued billing because cancellation requires active effort, and active effort requires attention, and attention had never been directed there. Bank account fees that were negotiable but had never been negotiated. A phone plan that was substantially more expensive than equivalent alternatives that had come to market since he had last evaluated it. The total monthly amount represented by costs that could be reduced or eliminated without any meaningful change to the quality of his life was not trivial. Annualized, it was the kind of number that, invested consistently over the previous decade, would have added meaningfully to his retirement account. It had instead been paid to companies that benefited from the automatic renewal assumption, from the fact that inertia is a more powerful force than optimization for most people most of the time. The review of fixed costs is not exciting. It does not feel like a wealth-building activity in the way that investment decisions feel like wealth-building activities. But the money that stops going to unnecessary or overpriced recurring charges goes somewhere, and if it goes consistently toward retirement accounts over a long enough period, the effect is real. The sixth habit is the one that I find most difficult to discuss, because it involves people rather than systems, and because the financial damage it produces is inseparable from relationships that carry genuine meaning and genuine obligation. It is the habit of allowing family financial obligations to consume retirement capital. I want to be careful about how I say this, because I am not making a moral argument. I am making an observation about outcomes. The parents who funded their children's education by drawing down retirement savings, the grandparents who provided down payments for houses and received nothing back in terms the retirement plan could use, the siblings who lent money that was never returned, and that represented years of compounded contributions that could have been building quietly in an account. Every one of these decisions came from a place of love. Every one of them felt right at the moment it was made. And every one of them transferred wealth from a person whose financial runway was shortening to a person whose financial runway was long and who had decades to build what was being given to them. What I observed in the people who navigated this well is that they had developed a way of thinking about family financial requests that separated the emotional content from the financial reality. The question they asked was not whether the family member needed help or whether helping them was the right thing to do. The question was whether this transfer of money could be absorbed without compromising the retirement that was being built. And when the honest answer to that question was no, they found other ways to help that did not involve retirement capital. Time, advice, connections, practical support, things that cost something other than the money that was irreplaceable. The retirement account is not selfish. It is the difference between being a person your family needs to support in 20 years and being a person who has the resources to be genuinely useful to them. Protecting it is not a failure of generosity. It is a form of long-term responsibility that is harder to explain in the moment than it is to understand from the other end. The seventh habit is the one that the investment industry has studied extensively, because it costs ordinary investors so much money so consistently that it has become one of the most documented patterns in behavioral finance. It is the habit of making investment decisions based on how the market feels, rather than what the plan requires. Here is the pattern as I have watched it operate in people I knew. The market rises. The news is good. There is a general feeling that things are going well and that investing feels safe. The person increases their exposure or moves money from conservative holdings into more aggressive ones. Then the market falls. The news turns negative. There is a feeling of danger and uncertainty. The person reduces their exposure or moves money out of the market entirely to protect what is left. And then the market recovers, as markets historically do, and the recovery happens in the accounts of the people who stayed in and misses the people who left. This cycle of buying when things feel safe and selling when things feel dangerous is the precise opposite of what the math rewards. It consistently produces a result that is worse than simply doing nothing, worse than leaving the money where it was and not touching it regardless of what the market did in between. And it is practiced constantly by people who understand intellectually that it is wrong. Because the emotional experience of watching an account value drop is more powerful in the moment than the intellectual understanding of what long-term investing requires. The people I watched accumulate real retirement wealth were not people who made brilliant investment decisions. They were people who made one decision and then refused to revisit it based on how the market felt in a given week or month or year. They automated the contribution. They chose an allocation they could hold without panic. And then they left it alone. For decades. Through the downturns that felt catastrophic and the recoveries that felt surprising, and the long stretches of nothing in particular that make up most of an investment lifetime. The discipline required is not the discipline of analysis. It is the discipline of inaction, of doing nothing, when everything in the emotional environment is pushing toward doing something. That discipline is harder than it sounds, but the evidence on what it produces over a full career is unambiguous. What all 7 of these habits have in common is the thing I said at the beginning. None of them felt wrong while they were happening. The lifestyle that expanded with each raise felt earned. The delay in starting felt temporary. The refinancing felt financially sensible. The single-source retirement plan felt adequate. The unchecked fixed costs felt like background noise. The family financial support felt like the right thing to do. The emotional market timing felt like prudence. The damage only became visible at the end. In a number that was half of what it should have been. In a retirement that required continued work rather than genuine choice. In the specific, quiet confusion of a person who did most things right and still arrived somewhere they did not expect to be. What I want to leave you with is not a list of regrets. It is a different question. The question is not, which of these habits destroyed the past? The past is fixed. The question is, which of these habits are still operating right now? Because every one of them is correctable, if the correction happens while there is still time for it to compound in the right direction. The lifestyle gap can be created today. The contribution can start today. The fixed costs can be reviewed this week. The family financial boundaries can be drawn from this point forward. The investment plan can be set and automated and left alone starting now. The habits that quietly destroy retirement are quiet because they are invisible while they are forming. The moment they get named, the moment they get seen clearly for what they are, they lose most of their power. That is what today was for. The rest is up to you.